Our next speaker is, get that right. Our next speaker is William Ned Friedman, who is the Arnold Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University and the 8th director of the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University in its 150-year plus history. Friedman's scholarly studies have focused on the earliest phases of the evolution of flowering plants, Darwin's so-called abominable mystery. He is also deeply interested in the history of early, i.e. pre-Darwinian evolutionary thought, and particularly the largely forgotten contributions of horticulturalists and botanists. As director of the Arnold Arboretum, Friedman has worked to expand the Arboretum's societal impact through diverse initiatives in public programming, digital communications, enhanced dialogue between scientists and the public, and the promotion of scientific scholarship, especially global change research within the living collections. As he continues to lead the Arboretum forward from its sesquicentennial year in 2022, two fundamental priorities will dominate the Arboretum's focus: environmental justice and combating climate change and extinction. I assume you put that in there.
As many words as I can figure out, absolutely. All right. Hopefully that's not too loud. And can you get that to full screen possibly? Perfect. So like one of our earlier speakers, I chose a title that would allow me to give any talk in which the mere mention of a tree occurred during the time I was allotted. And I really struggled to decide between two very different kinds of talks. But I thought, given the cast of speakers who were here, that there was obviously been quite a bit of sort of metaphorical analysis and thought about what trees mean in a sort of humanistic context. And I wanted to be quite literal and ask what a tree is. And I'd also like to add a time element that goes beyond a few thousand years and actually gets us into the billions of years. Because as an evolutionary biologist, I think that we are grounded in time, and Soyun was mentioning just a few minutes ago about restoration ecology. The very bizarre notion that there is something to restore to can be expanded and certainly beyond tens of thousands of years to millions and billions. So let's get started. I'm just going to try to answer a simple question today, which is, how did we get from the first photosynthetic bacterial cells to a magnificent pine in the Arnold Arboretum that you're looking at on a nice day in the conifer collection? And I am also going to step outside of the Abrahamic religions and tradition. They will not be mentioned henceforth. I'm much more of a person in love with Lucretius and the Epicureans and some of their followers. But I thought we'd set the scene here. For time doth change the nature of the world. One state of things must pass into another. Nothing remains the same. All things move on. All things does nature turn, transform, and change. One thing decays, grows faint and weak with age. Another grows and is despised no more. So therefore time, the whole nature of the world changes, and one state of the earth yields place to another. Truer words have never been uttered, even if he didn't know about evolution. So let me give you a very brief history of photosynthetic life. If we want to know what a tree is, we need to know where it came from. Did you know there was a time when there were no trees? When was that? These worlds we live in at this moment are just one of a succession of things. So let me just start by saying that life is a little over 3.5 billion years old. And that for the first 3 billion years, pretty much everything that was going on was happening in water. That isn't to say that on the surface of terrestrial plates of rock and so forth, that there weren't microbes. There certainly were bacteria. Eventually there would be fungi, but sort of macroscopic life of any sort did not exist. And in fact, when it comes to plants being on land, the things that we are surrounded by that create the air that we breathe, the oxygen, out of a 24-hour day, getting onto land out of that water and being able to photosynthesize came very close to midnight, about 475 million years ago, out of, again, a 3.5+ billion year history of life. This is what life looked like about 3.5 billion years ago. There's not much of it left, but these are microbial communities. These are called stromatolites. You can find these off the coast of Western Australia. They're basically just beautiful, diverse communities of bacteria that are, growing. They're aerobic zones, anaerobic zones, and so forth, and they leave behind rock concretions. There are other places where you can find stromatolites today, but that was really sort of the first set of complex ecosystems. And the first bacterium to really pick up on the trick of photosynthesis goes back well over 3 billion years. But of the many different groups of bacteria that can photosynthesize, that can take energy of light and capture that and put it into chemical bonds, only one of them uses water as a source of electrons and gives off oxygen. And that would be what are the cyanobacteria. And you're looking at a picture of them right there. And this is particularly important because, of course, the Earth was born without oxygen, and there would be no oxygen for us to breathe had this one single event not taken place. There'd be plenty of photosynthesis going on, but it would have given rise to many different things, none of them oxygen. So the oxygenation of the Earth, which is really a waste product of photosynthesis, is by these cyanobacteria. Eventually, a couple of billion years later, one of those cyanobacteria was engulfed by an organism like us that had a nucleus in it, that had chromosomes. And instead of digesting that bacterium, a symbiosis was born. And that symbiosis was born in such a way that a thing that we now call a chloroplast is the descendant of free-living photosynthetic bacteria. And we know from our phylogenetic reconstructions and a variety of other things that the first green plants that were nucleated like us and had a chloroplast about 1.6 billion years, a little bit more, that keeps getting pushed back, were single-celled organisms. They swam in the water, and you can see the flagella, little swimming apparatus. And that's, again, on its way. If you think about the connections I'm going to make, somehow that's in the ancestry of every tree on Earth. Okay. Took another billion years or more before that group got onto land in a way which had profound effects. And we think a small little disc-like mass of cells, all of them green and capable of photosynthesis, somehow was able to make a go of it progressively over time, drier edges or margins of freshwater bodies. Okay. So imagine there's lakes, there's rock, there's not much soil because we don't have a lot of ecology going on, and so there's nothing to decay. And with time, this gave rise to all of land plants, from ferns to mosses to flowering plants, including orchids. Now, someone did write about this, and one of my favorite people, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, and the first person in England to write about evolution long before Charles did. But he also, I think you can see from his poetry, was a great fan of Lucretius and wrote many things that were along the same lines. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, microscopes, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire, and larger limbs assume. When countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. Which is pretty magnificent. Now, he was an evolutionist, so it was his working hypothesis that the ancestors of the animals and plants on land were in the water, and they came out of that water, and this is exactly what happened. And the first plants didn't have leaves, they didn't have stems in a sense, they didn't have roots, they were just a flattened body of green photosynthetic cells that kind of gripped and the surface of rocks, and then eventually moderate amounts of soil. These groups are still around. This is a group called the liverworts, and they're very beautiful. They're around Connecticut. You can find them, as well as some of the other groups that are here. And if we look at the fossil record, it takes quite a while before plants learn a really important trick, which is how to grow up and to grow from your tip. And in the fossil record, some 425, 30, maybe 40 million years ago, you can find these very small plants. They're, as you can see, just a couple of centimeters. It's a single axis, and it grew from its tip, and at the end of that axis is a reproductive body. And then it disperses its reproductive propagules and a life cycle is renewed. Now, that's going to be tough to get to a tree because there's another important thing that has to happen. You have to learn how to branch. And about 430 plus million years ago, that kind of organism you just saw actually picked up a developmental trick in which the growing tip that proliferates and makes new axes actually figured out how to bifurcate. But once you can bifurcate, I'm going to show you almost anything is possible. So this is, again, a very small organism, and each of the bifurcations ends in a little sac that holds reproductive propagules. And here are some of the things that came from that. You start to elaborate the body. You can see almost everything, though, is still a bifurcation. But you can have specialization. Some things are creeping, some things are aerial. So you can imagine absorption on one part and photosynthesis. But you'll notice there are no roots and there are no leaves. And these fossils. This is someone's put together a model of it, but the fossils are abundant and quite rich. This comes from the Rhynie Chert in Scotland. Now, if you start to branch unequally, if you imagine if you branch equally, you can make a nice hemisphere. But if you want to grow tall, each time you bifurcate, imagine that one of your bifurcations is dominant and one is subdominant. There's all kinds of terminology, but that's not important. What happens, as you can see behind me, is it looks like you have a main axis. But in fact, you have a main axis where there's been a subdominant lateral and a continuation, it goes aerial. Next time, it branches in the other direction. And so from going from a matter of just, half a foot or foot, all of a sudden you can reach a meter, maybe even a little bit more. And we had a world for a while that was full of organisms about that size. And this is one. Again, you'll notice there's nothing on those axes. They're not stems yet. They're not anything other than axes. Call them telomes. And then the really important trick is, if you think about photosynthesis, the worst way you could do it is with a round cylinder, surface area to volume. You want panels that are thin, that we would call leaves. And we know that the first evolutionary origin of leaves took place a little over 420 million years ago. And I should mention that the structure we call a leaf has evolved at least 5 different times. So many different groups of leafless plants somehow acquired the ability to produce photosynthetic panels that are very efficient at capturing the sun with high surface volume. This is just the first one, and it's a very nice fossil record. I think Bargwanathia is from Australia, if I recall correctly. And some of the descendants of that first origin of leaves are still around in our woods. This is the ground cedar or one of the lycopods. And they're very simple leaves. They're just a little sort of needle-like. They have a single vein. And they are not very different than the leaves that you would have seen on their ancestors 400 million years ago. It's really remarkable. You can go outside in Storrs, Connecticut, and you can find little windows into 420 million years ago. By 450 million years ago, if you add in the hornworts and liverworts. So by about 390 million years ago, we had leafless plants, we had plants with leaves, we had plants that had figured out how to branch unequally, and you have a range of plant communities in this drawing that show a world of plants that you still would have towered over because they maxed out at about a little over a meter. There are no trees on land. So it's important to think about when we want to conceptualize the meaning of trees, they are a relatively recent arrival in Earth's history. So what came next? Obviously, you have to make the leap to trees. Well, again, I return to Lucretius, who thought about the trees. In the beginning, Earth gave birth to plants after their kind and ringed with shining green the hills and plains. The flowery meadows shone with verdure. Then between the various trees, a mighty race began, all galloping to be the first to shoot up into the sky. And again, Lucretius was on to something. There was a race for the sky, and that's actually the story I want to tell today. So first, I have to tell you a little bit about what a tree is, and we're going to just work through a little bit of terminology, really just a couple of words. But I want you to know that the structure or within a tree that makes it possible to be a tree, and I'll give you a simple example of what a tree is. It's a plant that can increase its girth over time, right? So if you think about a young tree, it's a sapling, it's this big, an old tree is this big. How does it do it? The structure that does that is called a cambium. It's a single layer of cells inside of the tree, the whole length of the tree. Its only job is to basically chop themselves in half longitudinally and create new cells. And those cells become wood and conduct water, or they chop themselves in half on the other side of them, and they make the stuff that makes sugars move within a plant. Now, I'm going to tell you that that structure evolved 6 different times in 6 different lineages, which is pretty phenomenal. So it really was a race to the sky because it happened in a very, very short period of time, in what I would call the blink of an evolutionary eye. So these are the groups that I'm going to be telling you about. The names are not important, but I want you to see that the first plant, and this is some relatively recent work, we know now that 407 million years ago, we have the first evidence that plants know how to increase their girth and make wood. They do not become trees immediately. They just become slightly larger herbaceous plants, right? Just a little bit taller. You don't start with this trick and go from this tall to 100 feet. You go from this tall to this tall. And you might imagine as you want to have a bigger axis, because as you get taller, you have to support more weight. But then I'm going to tell you about the 6 groups of plants on land which individually became tree-sized organisms. We'll go through them. So what makes a tree a tree? All right. If you look on the right, classic, what we call a cookie disc or tree cookie, you've got a large tree. And again, the man in the middle is pointing towards the center. And just under the bark is that ring of cells. It's been there since the earliest days of that sapling. And every time that cell divides longitudinally, upright, it kicks another cell that becomes part of the wood. Or if it does it the other way towards the outside of the axis, it becomes a cell that moves sugars. But over time, you keep kicking them. And what you could imagine is the cambium has to keep moving out, right? You can't squish things in there. You're moving backwards. And so if you were to look at a tree, this is just a wedge of one, under that bark, you would find this beautiful layer of cells that is essentially the key to increasing the axis and its girth. And I can just show you, well, in the right-hand side, you see there's a ring. That's the cambium conceptualized. And you see the 3 cells that say C. And those are cambium cells. And in the middle, you can see that C is given rise to an X, which is a xylem cell, a water-conducting cell. And on the right side of that upper one, you see a C has cut itself in half and given rise to a phloem cell that moves sugars. Well, creating a cambium, I don't know how hard or easy it is, but the fact that it happened 6 times in a relatively short period of time is really quite wonderful. This is a section you would see under a microscope of what a cambium produces. And this is a tree. This is a pine tree. If you do enough anatomy, you can tell these things. And that very light blue layer of cells where the yellow arrows are is that layer that encircles the axis. And what you're seeing is the rows. It's like a repeat print operation. Each cambium cell clones itself, clones itself, clones itself, and you get a row of cells that are derived from it. And you can see, in this case, it's a very nice straight row. These cells are very tall. They're dead at maturity, and they're the cells that move water in this pine tree. And that's really important. That's how you increase the axis girth of the plant. And in conifers, like many pines, like this might be a pine, actually, this could be a spruce too. They are really regular. You just see these rows of cells all derived from one cambium cell. And actually what you're seeing also are growth rings, which we don't need to go into today. But that's what you're seeing under a microscope as the cells get smaller towards the end of a growing season. And this is what you might see 3-dimensionally under a scanning electron microscope. Wood is just an incredibly beautiful tissue. And there are wood anatomists around the world that really know their stuff. So let's talk about the origin of trees. So I did tell you that the first time a plant is known to have created a cambium around itself, it did not become a tree. This is an axis that's about, I think about 1 centimeter, okay? So it may have been a plant, not unlike the one I showed you earlier that learned how to grow tall, but it somehow was able to prolong its growth. And can you see how the cells are in rows? They look very wood-like. Now, that's not proof in and of itself. There are a number of other features of that cross-section that are central to being able to make a definitive determination of it, but that's some really old wood. Oh, sorry. And that's what I think this plant looked like. It was not unlike this one. But there's been some amazing work, actually in the state of New York. There are these quarries where we've now discovered the first forests. And I'm going to show you, I think, what are, I think, hauntingly beautiful images. But I'm going to tell you about the second cambium, a little over 388. Sorry. For those at home, I'm sure you're going deaf. And we've known about these tree bases for quite a long time because actually these are old quarry sites. This is in Gilboa, New York. I've never been to the site, but it's on my life list. That's the base of a tree, 388 million years ago. And you can see three-dimensionally that they have them outside in the parks. And on the left, you can see there's a meter bar. So these were trees that grew 7, 8, 9 meters tall, 10 meters. Well, that's substantial, 35 feet. And it's a group called the cladoxylopsids. If you've never heard of them, that's because they're not around anymore. They're related to ferns that are around, but they were some of the first trees on Earth. I wish they were still around, but they're not. And we have other fossil sites around the world, so we have good reconstructions of what some of these early cladoxylopsid forests might have looked like. And in another forest site in New York, what you have is not the forest. You have what's called a paleosol. It is a fossilized soil. Some cataclysmic event washed the entire forest away and buried the soils. And in the middle, on the top, you can see there's a divot, right? Nice little pool. That is where a cladoxylopsid, big structure, once sat. And underneath, even though I can't point it out on the screen, are the roots that were coming out of that base. So we have a reverse template image of a forest. And this is really an extraordinary thing because we know now actually what it was living with. The second group of trees to come along are called the progymnosperms. And they start modestly, a few meters in height with some nice woody axes. Again, they acquire this cambium on their own. And they eventually get to be some very large trees. You can see a classic old image, I think I've taken it in Oklahoma, of a progymnosperm tree base. And again, on the right, you can see a schematic of it. It gives you a sense of size, the bar being, I think, 2 meters. They look very conifer-like, and they are really large trees. And if you were to look at their wood, and we have good 350-million-year-old wood, three-dimensionally preserved, does that look a lot like the pine wood I showed you? Lots of rows of cells? Well, I'm going to come back to why it does look a lot like conifers and pine wood now in a minute. And here's this new site in New York that was just published in 2020. You can see the arrows are pointing to where the stump was. There's the divot. And they've excavated just very carefully in these fossilized soils the extent of the root systems of these trees, which is just beyond beautiful, right? I mean, to imagine, and most people have no idea what a tree's root system looks like. They think it grows straight down, when in fact, it grows laterally for distances that are almost unimaginable. And I'll just show you some more. This is a progymnosperm root system. The center of every converging radius is where the trunk was. And what's been excavated are for meters. Again, that's a meter bar on the bottom right. For meters and meters is the root system of a 388-million-year-old progymnosperm tree. So we already know now land plants 475, first cambium 407, and then just a mere 20 million years later, we're talking about forests that look nothing like our forests. So, and again, you can see that on the left image, you see something that looks like a Y. Those are the roots that are woody, and they have just amazing preservation there. The next group that come along just a little bit later, we think, but we're not so sure as things get pushed back, depending on what you find. whether you're first, second, or third may change with more evidence, are lycophytes. And again, you remember I told you about that plant with the first leaves, and I told you that that plant and its descendants are still around in our woodlands here. Well, some of those plants acquired a cambium and became these monstrous, beautiful, weird, they look like they're holding two pom-poms, trees. And these are arborescent lycophytes. Their roots, we think, were green and photosynthetic. They may even have had leaves growing off of their root-like structures. It's a really an enigmatic, wonderful group with tremendous preservation. Back in the, it's no longer there, but at Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, they had for a while a glass house with full-size three-dimensional models of these plants. And there you can see a giant dragonfly, probably with a 2-foot wingspan, next to one of these arborescent lycophytes. So fourth cambium, third tree, 385 million years ago. And this is from the Denver Museum of Natural History. They did a beautiful set of reconstructions. You're looking down at that photosynthetic root system. There, as you notice, or may not have noticed, every one of these trees produced 4 rooted outgrowths, always 4. And you can see it here if you go to Glasgow, and there's a wonderful park in the town where there's a fossil site. These are the trunks of these arborescent lycophytes that you can see with 4 rooting systems going out. And at this forest in New York, this is a rooting system. The trunk is actually most of the way up towards the upper left. If you can see, it's somewhat asymmetric. There may have been environmental conditions that made the root system go in one direction versus another. I don't know. But these are trees that are racing to the sky. The 5th cambium and the 4th tree, this is later, some 370 million years ago, are horsetails. And again, if you wander wet areas in Connecticut, you can find horsetails. You may know that they are these wonderful striate silicaceous plants that grow. They're rhizomatous, they can move. But imagine instead of an axis this big, one that had a cambium, that stuff on the, you can see the centimeters on the right, that's an axis this big that made wood. And in the right-hand image, you can see one of those trees tucked in with the arborescent lycophytes that we were just talking about in a forest. And again, we can actually look at their wood anatomy, and we can see the beautiful rows of cells that would have been produced by a cell that was perpetually embryonic, that basically made duplicates of itself that became wood. Now, the last group that I'm going to talk about now is actually not a tree, it's a shrub. And it's a little bit later, 360 million years ago. It's got some really wild, beautiful wood anatomy going on, but it's called Sphenophyllum. It had leaves, as did the horsetails. And they were very beautiful leaves and whorls. Not a lot is known about what it's related to, but it's certainly present in the fossil record. And here's some of its wood again. It's just, you can see the rows of cells that tell you a cambium, a tubular layer of single cells. It's actually pushing out new cells to make wood over time that allows your axis to get bigger, which means you can grow longer and taller. So what happened to all of these groups of trees? You haven't probably come across a horsetail in your woodlands lately that's that big. And sadly, the cladoxylopsids went extinct. Most of them were done by the end of the Permian, which is really a bummer because would have liked them to see through. The arborescent lycophytes did not go extinct. And you're saying, wait a second, when was the last time I saw a tree like this? And the answer is you haven't seen a tree like this, but they're almost extinct. There's one single group of plants that's descended from the arborescent lycophytes, and these are called quillworts. They're very small, water-loving plants. You can find them again in Connecticut. They're around the world. And you might say, well, that doesn't look anything like a tree. And you'd be right. It does have a cambium, and what it is a tree that's evolved into something quite small. All right. Evolution is not unidirectional. You can get big, you can race to the sky, you can also race to the ground. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. So that's the last of the arborescent lycophytes. It's a really small, what we call herbaceous plant. And if you're thinking that that's a familiar story, it is, because of course, dinosaurs are not extinct. And hopefully, school children are taught properly that dinosaurs that are large have gone extinct, but that there are huge numbers of dinosaurs on Earth, and they're called birds. And That's the exact same story with that plant I told you about with the lycophytes. They're not extinct, they're just small. And we can look at phylogenies and we can talk about the fact that birds nestle right into a phylogeny containing all the other extinct dinosaurs. So there are the arborescent horsetails, and as I'm about to regretfully tell you, they are all extinct. There are still horsetails, but no descendants of the arborescent horsetails. Okay, so we still have horsetails, but the trees are gone. As for Sphenophyllum, it too is gone. So that leaves just one group that's still around. And progymnosperms as a conceptual framework of a kind of tree are gone. But this third cambium second tree gave rise to all of our seed plants. That means all of our conifers are descended from these trees. These are some spruces at the Arnold Arboretum. That means all of our ginkgo trees, one species, are descended from the progymnosperms. That means all of our cycads that look palm-like, but they're coned, that are from the warmer parts of the world, are descended from those trees. That means this small group called the Netales, which is Mormon tea, ephedra, out in the deserts of the world, and Welwitschia in the Namib Desert, are descended from progymnosperms. And it means that every flowering plant, all 350,000 species of extant flowering plants, are descended from those progymnosperms and inherited their cambium. So why does pine wood look so much like progymnosperm wood? Because it's a descendant. And it looks a lot like it because it basically kept its wood characteristics, its cambium characteristics, all the way to this day. When you look at a pine and its wood anatomy, you are echoing back to a progymnosperm some 300 and something million years ago. So once seed plants got started, they were all woody plants. They all had a cambium descended from the progymnosperms. And what's really profoundly startling to me is that for the next 230 million years, every seed plant with a cambium was a tree or a shrub or a liana, a woody vine. So there was a world, if you had herbaceous plants, they would have been plants that were ferns or lycophytes. They would have been things that had never been trees. And this group that became trees seemed inevitably trapped in treeness. And then something happened 230 million years into their journey. The flowering plants were born, and the first flowering plants were arborescent. They weren't large trees, but they figured out a way to lose arborescence and stop being trees. And we have this in the fossil record 125 million years ago, flowering plants being about 137 million years of age. Shortly after they are born, you see things go from being trees to being entirely herbaceous, in this case, aquatic, and almost certainly losing its cambium. Here's another fossil from about 125 million years ago. It's related to your buttercups. And it clearly is not a tree or a shrub. It's a small herbaceous green plant. All of our herbaceous plants that are flowering plants were once trees. So in a wonderful irony, we start with herbaceous plants, we learn how to grow in girth, we become trees, and then for 230 million years, those plants that were trees were able to do only one thing, be trees, shrubs, or lianas. And then somehow, with the origin of flowering plants, all kinds of groups figured out how to leave behind treeness and become herbaceous. Really interesting. Every single flower in your garden is ultimately descended from a tree. And we've known about this. This is the Bussey Institution at Harvard, which was right next to the Arnold Arboretum. It's a major life sciences research institution. And people who worked there actually began to think very hard about the evolution of herbaceousness, of essentially not being woody, being smaller. And they very quickly understood from the fossil record, as well as from our knowledge of evolutionary relationships, that most of the herbaceous plants on Earth have very many different times acquired or lost the business of being arborescent. So they said the evolution of herbaceousness occurred many times in angiosperm history, flowering plant history. As they said, the most important anatomical difference between a woody plant and an herb lies in the degree of activity of the cambium. So if you were to go out to your garden and to your tomato plant and take a razor blade and cut it, what you would find is it is herbaceous. It's not tree, it's not arborescent, but it actually has wood, just not very much of it. So it bears the signature of its ancestry of having produced wood. So here's your tomato, and you see some labeling, but on the top right, you see there's a vascular cambium. And in fact, as your tomato plant gets wider and wider, it increases in girth over the season. It's producing wood, just not a lot of it. And it's an annual plant, so it's not going to add growth rings or anything like that. So imagine that basically 2/3 of our flowering plants that are of them, all of them that are herbaceous still bear the signature of tree ancestry inside their bodies, even if they only live for weeks. And in fact, this little plant here, which is an important plant for genetics and genomics, it's called Arabidopsis. It's a little plant, just this big, nothing, right? Little. It produces a very, very small amount of wood. And if you modify 2 genes with little genetic engineering on the right, you'll see there's a lot of wood. Now, when I say a lot of wood, the axis is still just a couple of millimeters, but we can turn it on and make it woodier. No Arabidopsis trees yet. But here's the question. I've told you about all these plants that have the signature of being descended from trees, but are herbaceous, that are in our gardens. But can you actually lose the cambium completely? Turns out very, very hard. Only happened a few times. Happened in water lilies, happened in that aquatic plant. Typically, it's associated with evolution into water. It also happened, though, in 1/3 of the flowering plants that are living. They're called the monocots, and it was in their common ancestor. So it's a single instance that about some 100,000 species of flowering plants are descended from a single species that lost its cambium entirely. So grasses are all without a cambium. Palm trees are also without a cambium. These wonderful daffodils lack a cambium. There's a very large group that don't have a cambium, but the instance is only once. Can you regain a cambium? And the answer is wonderfully yes. So in those wonderful monocots, this group of plants that include the grasses and so many other things, there is an instance of the creation of a 7th cambium. And it happened, we don't know the exact timing, but sometime probably in the last 50 or 60 million years. And it's the Joshua trees and their relatives. That's me, the spring break with my, out in the Mojave Desert, standing behind, in front of a tree that has a novel cambium. Its ancestors lacked a cambium. It's figured out how to essentially increase in girth. But what makes these trees so wonderful is they don't make wood. They have a totally different way of making sure that they make new water conducting cells. They actually make individual sort of pipelines, the length of the tree. So it would look nothing like wood of any of the other groups. So here's this group, when you go there, that is the 7th instance of cambium and the 6th group to ascend to a tree size. And so its ancestors didn't have a cambium, and those ancestors did have a cambium, and those ancestors back didn't have a cambium. So no cambium, cambium, no cambium, cambium. That's the history of that Joshua tree over hundreds of millions of years. And this is what the insides of these things look like. They're just beautiful, wild structures, but there's no rows of cells, as you might imagine. So let's just ask a couple of quick, simple questions. Tree? Yes. London plane tree, and quite beautiful, one of our specimens. Tree? No. Okay, this is the water lotus. I'm going to tell you that the closest living relative of the water lotus is that. So that's another instance of a tree ancestor that dove into the water and lost all woodiness and all cambium. So I might ask the question in terms of arbor essence, if your ancestors were trees, do you retain any of that concept or quality of treeness? I won't answer the question, but the closest living relative of water lotus is Platanus, the London plane tree. Tree, well, they have wood. Is wood enough? I don't know. Maybe it's a small, very short-lived tree. Tree, it's arborescent, but it doesn't have a cambium. It's part of that group of grasses and everything else that is absolutely unable to increase its girth. Here's the trick. If you go to the base of a pine tree, at the bottom of the tree, it's this wide. You look up, it's this wide. You look to the tips, it's this wide. Look carefully at a palm tree. And other than some little bit of swelling at the base where all the roots come out, the axis has a single dimension. It has not increased. All of the axis growth that creates the diameter happens at the tip, no cambium. Hence, one might argue, not a tree, even though we call them palm trees. Tree ferns, tree. This isn't graded. I just want to.
It feels like
Okay.
like, but then when you really look at it.
Well, I can assure you it's not a tree. It might be arborescent, but actually tree fern axes are about that thick and they have no cambium. Most of what is propping that up are leaf bases with roots growing from the tip that literally reinforce the axis. The axis is like any other fern, it's small. So there's no wood, no cambium, but we call them tree ferns. So I'm going to end with just a passage from Agnes Arbor, who was a really fine morphologist, also a bit of a philosopher, I think, who summed it up perfectly. Actually, to define a tree is a very difficult matter. What we need is to arrive at some answer to the question, what is the true inwardness of the tree habit? And I will not leave you with an answer, but I hope I've grounded you in the fact that the trees you look at have history. It's a deep history. It's an interesting history. And it took place without any human intervention. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk, Ned. You definitely covered the largest span of history of all our speakers. So. Yeah. Any questions from inside the room? Yeah, Betsy.
Well, first of all, that was fantastic. Yeah, like, if you want to keep talking about it, I'd love to keep listening, but like, because I feel like I learned so much, but it did actually make me, are you familiar with Nehemiah Grew's Anatomy of Plants? Ah, yes. I love the illustrations in that book, and the images that you had are just like so, I could look at those all day long. They're just so astonishing and stunning. So that's not a question, that's a comment, but thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Well, just if I may respond. So Nehemiah Grew, for those of you who don't know, published this magnificent volume on the anatomy of plants, the internal cellular structure. And actually, you can get prints at our home that are not from Nehemiah Grew, but are based on 19th century prints. And you are looking at exactly what he was looking at, which is this magnificent world of the cellular structure of all kinds of plants. So you should, if you ever go to a wood anatomy website, you'll find, I think, that there is beautiful, although not as expertly executed as someone who's a botanical illustrator in terms of what you're trying to demonstrate. But Nehemiah Grew and many others of his ilk, just fantastic.
So you.
Thank you. Wonder, that word actually came to my mind when I was hearing your talk, and I became almost like emotional, and it's really mystery and wonder, just looking at the whole history of the trees. I'm just wondering, I have two questions. So one is about your talk, because they have a cambium and non-cambium and cambium. So why do you think the reason for having them? What is the drivers? I don't know. There might be, something that you can answer or what, but yeah.
So Lucretius was on the right track. There's a bit of a race for the sky. So you could say there's a point where you have plant communities and there's competition for light. That might be part of it. So if you have a cambium, you can continue to grow and you can grow taller because you have the biomechanical support. Because as you produce wood, you become stronger. But there's another aspect of it which isn't necessarily a race for life. And I think it's important to imagine that there are many different reasons. One is the longevity of an organism. So if one can live beyond a year or 2 years, or 3 years, and can live 5 and 6 years and continue to grow and each year reproduce, your life cycle now takes on, each successful establishment can live for longer periods of time. But there is a point, I think, and that's one of the things I think that's so interesting about the fact that within about 20 million years, we have 5 different groups racing for the sky. There are these ecological pressures, or there are these things that become evident as plant diversity expands and as things become more competitive, to figure out ecological and reproductive strategies that allow you to grow bigger, have greater reproductive output, and sort of hold your ground for longer periods of time. If you're an annual plant, you make it, you reproduce, and you hope one of your seeds is going to make it. But if you have 100 cycles, you hope that your odds are better. So I think there are a number of aspects to this that drive it. But it is so important to realize that nothing is unidirectional. There's no force moving us towards trees. It's if the conditions are right and you can make a life of it in a pond, then lose the cambium. It's not needed. And for the monocots, which I think is one of the really, an extremely diverse group of flowering plants, very evolutionarily successful, let's put it that way. They have been happy without a cambium for a very long time. And they found new environments and ecological places to live that, for example, trees wouldn't exploit. So I think there's always, that's why I think it's always a matter of, there's an event, we have to understand the event, then there's the outcome of that event. But I think competition and sort of resource allocation towards reproduction is probably the most important ones.
Kind of return us to Betsy's talk. I was curious how you saw the dynamic relationship between trees and the human body, especially the proportional of nature of branching structures in the human body, and how you account for that possibly in an evolutionary framework. Small question.
Well, I can't account for it in an evolutionary framework simply because our common ancestor with plants is a single-celled, non-photosynthetic organism. So multicellularity of animals as well as plants is separately evolved. So everything that you think has a resemblance is really a working of our own minds. But if you think about it, there are these arteries within plants. There are these bundles of what we would call vasculature. They're moving sugars, they're moving waters, but they don't circulate the way we do. But people would have been aware of these structures being in plants and animals by the time Nehemiah Grew was coming along and so forth. And so I think, and I'm not, because I don't have any credentials in history, I won't go too far, but I think there's always this interest in sort of, especially early in the investigation of the body, the human body, animal bodies, and plant bodies. They're not thinking about this in evolutionary terms. They don't have any way of conceptualizing this. So they are looking at the question, can we come up with a language that describes these circulatory systems? And so my imagining is that, in fact, that's very much what's going on. And I'm thinking of Hook. And again, you're working between plants and animals, plants. I mean, there isn't a separate, yes, they know they're different things, but at the same time, they don't have first principles.
And also thinking that
I would also say that they're, knowing that they're separate things, but also not quite realizing that they retain their separateness, that maybe they can transmute from one to the other, so the notion insects might just kind of grow out of the muck, or like there's the myth of the barnacle tree, like, what is it that it gives birth to ducks? Like there are these crazy illustrations of these, birds flying off of the tree as though the tree, just yielded these living creatures, these animal creatures. And so, yeah, so it's interesting to see how, knowing they're different, but then thinking of them as more flexible and more kind of maybe crossing that border and think of any more. I feel like maybe it was Linnaeus who was just like, no. There are plants and there are animals. Boom, done. But, I don't know. So just.
Any other questions? Yeah, Michael?
What happened to bees? Yeah, I mean, somehow you've shown us, these flowering plants. And I think, okay, bees, gotta have bees. But I mean, how do these things reproduce?
So no, you don't gotta have bees. The world would be perfectly fine without bees, and was for a very long time without bees. They're nice to have bees. I'm not against bees, but they're not a necessary. Once bees are around and they become involved in coevolution with mostly or almost, yeah, I guess exclusively with flowering plants, it becomes apparent that there are many bee pollinated species that would be unhappy if you didn't have bees. But most plants, the first flowering plants, for example, had nothing to do with bees. Probably beetles were moving pollen. There are plenty of plants that move their reproductive structures around with wind. Conifers certainly require no insects to reproduce. Same with ginkgo trees. Cycads actually do require insects. That's a coevolution. And that last group, that's the Nitales, is sort of a mixed system of wind and insects, but not bees. So yeah, there's a role for bees, but they're late. It's kind of after the fact.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Ned, for that.